Picture a city where, for 12 straight years, a monster rides the train every single day. He sits next to strangers. He smiles at kids on the platform. He asks people for directions like he's just another tired commuter. And nobody suspects a thing, not because he's clever, but because the government running that city has already decided, officially, that men like him simply don't exist. That's not a movie pitch. That's Soviet Russia in the 1980s, and the man on the train is about to become one of the most prolific killers in modern history. Rostov Oblast, southern Russia, the late 1970s. Flat, gray farmland, and towns stitched together by train lines. The stations weren't just transportation, they were where life actually happened. People waited there for hours. Kids skipped school and hung around the platforms because there was nowhere else to go. It was loud, crowded, and nobody was really watching anyone. Which worked out perfectly for Andrei Chikatilo, because he was, by every account, one of the most unremarkable men you could imagine. 40s, married, 2 kids, a former schoolteacher who'd moved into a traveling sales job. Balding. Thick glasses. The kind of guy whose name you'd forget 5 minutes after shaking his hand. And that ordinariness wasn't an accident, it was the whole disguise. To understand how he got that way, you have to go back further, to a childhood that almost every researcher who's touched this case points to. He was born in 1936 in a Ukrainian village, right in the middle of a famine that killed millions. He grew up on stories, some true, some maybe not, about what desperate people had done just to survive. His father came home from the war branded a traitor by his own country, a label that hung over the whole family for years. And Chikatilo himself was bullied relentlessly as a kid, humiliated in ways he apparently never got past. He tried to outrun it, honestly. Good student. Did his military service. Became a teacher. But even there, cracks kept showing, more than one complaint about how he acted around students, and instead of anyone actually investigating, the system just quietly shuffled him from school to school. Paperwork instead of accountability. His first known kill happened in December of 1978. A 9-year-old girl. And here's the part of the story that still makes people's jaws drop: police actually solved it. Or thought they did. They arrested a young man, pressured a confession out of him, and eventually executed him, for a murder Chikatilo committed. An innocent man paid with his life while the real killer walked home. For a few years after that, silence. Maybe the close call scared him. Maybe he just hadn't found his rhythm. But by the early 80s, it started again, and this time it didn't stop. He went after people the world had already stopped paying attention to: runaway teens, homeless kids, women hitchhiking alone, anyone who could disappear for weeks before someone even filed a report. His method barely changed: strike up a conversation, seem harmless, offer food, offer to show them something nearby. Patient. Polite. In a country where people were trained to trust a modest older man carrying a briefcase, that politeness did all the work. By 1982, bodies were surfacing near the rail lines with the same brutal signature, again and again. Local investigators started to suspect they weren't looking at isolated tragedies. But here's the wall they ran into: official Soviet doctrine insisted that this kind of crime, the obsessive, repeat, predatory violence the West seemed fixated on, simply couldn't happen in a socialist society. Admitting otherwise wasn't just embarrassing. It was ideologically off-limits. So even as the evidence stacked up, investigators were pressured to downplay it, to keep it quiet, to avoid the one word everybody else would have reached for immediately. And that silence bought Chikatilo more time than almost any killer in modern history has ever gotten. By 1983, even Moscow couldn't pretend this wasn't happening. A senior detective got sent down to take over the case, and, almost unheard of for the USSR at the time, they brought in a psychiatrist to build an actual behavioral profile of the killer. And weirdly, it landed close to the truth: a man in his 40s, sexually inadequate, using violence as some kind of substitute and completely invisible in his day-to-day life. On paper, it was basically Chikatilo. In practice, it was one lead among dozens, and Soviet forensic tools in the 1980s were nowhere near what investigators in the West had access to. Then came the moment that should have ended this whole case years ahead of schedule. In 1984, police pulled Chikatilo aside after he was spotted acting strangely near a bus station. They searched his bag and found a knife, some rope, items that lined up uncomfortably well with what they knew. This should have been it. Instead, forensic science let them down. Semen from the crime scenes had been typed as blood group AB. Chikatilo's own blood came back as type A. By what they knew at the time, that ruled him out completely. Nobody realized, because almost nobody understood this yet, even in Western labs, that a small percentage of people are non-secretors, meaning their blood type and the type expressed in other bodily fluids simply don't match. Chikatilo happened to be one of them. The evidence that should have caught him ended up clearing him instead. He served a short sentence on an unrelated minor charge and walked out. For a while, he kept his head down. But by 1985, the killing picked back up, faster and more violent than before. Investigators, increasingly convinced their killer was somehow tied to the rail network, since nearly every victim had turned up near a station or a line, launched one of the strangest, largest surveillance operations in Soviet history. Plainclothes officers spent hours standing on freezing platforms. Hidden cameras got wired into train cars. Thousands of ordinary passengers were quietly logged, day after day, for years. It was grinding, thankless work, and almost nobody outside the investigation even knew it was happening. Coverage of the case was restricted, so most families in the region had no idea a killer this active was moving through their towns. Parents kept sending their kids to school, to the market, to those exact same platforms, with absolutely no warning. By 1988, the case had swallowed years of manpower and still didn't have a name attached to it. And the worst of it hadn't even come yet. Going into 1990, the man investigators had been chasing for the better part of a decade had gotten careless, or maybe he just felt untouchable by now. In January, an 11-year-old boy was lured away near a movie theater with the promise of rare foreign films. His body turned up in the woods weeks later. 7 weeks after that, a 10-year-old boy vanished from a train station, last seen heading toward Rostov's botanical gardens. On November 6, 1990, Chikatilo committed what would end up being his final murder. 2 weeks later, a patrolling officer at a rail station clocked a disheveled, middle-aged man acting off enough to warrant a closer look. There was no chase, no dramatic confrontation, just a tired cop doing the same kind of routine stop that had been done thousands of times before, except this time, they finally had the right guy. For the first several days, Chikatilo gave them nothing. He'd talked his way out of trouble once already, and it looked like he planned to do it again. Just stay quiet, wait it out. What actually broke him wasn't pressure. It was flattery. Investigators brought back the same psychiatrist who'd helped build the original profile years earlier, and instead of interrogating Chikatilo, he talked to him almost like a peer, genuinely curious about how his mind worked. And it landed. A man who'd spent his whole life feeling invisible finally felt seen, even under the worst possible circumstances, and he started talking. Once he started, he couldn't stop. Over the next several weeks, he walked detectives through case after case with a level of detail only the actual killer could have known, details that led police to remains they'd never even found. By the end, he'd confessed to more murders than police had ever officially pinned on a single person in the region's history. By the time Chikatilo went to trial in April 1992, the country that had spent a decade denying he could exist didn't exist itself anymore. The Soviet Union had collapsed just months before, and the newly uncensored Russian press covered this trial with an intensity that would have been unimaginable a few years earlier. He sat through it in a specially built iron cage, a measure that says a lot about how much fury this case had built up. At one point, a relative of one of his victims threw a heavy object at him mid-hearing. When guards moved in to arrest the man, other victims' families physically stepped in and blocked them. Chikatilo himself didn't make it easy to watch, shouting, twitching, at times looking almost like he was performing a breakdown for the room. Whether that was real or calculated is still argued about today. Psychiatrists who examined him were clear either way. Severely disturbed, yes, but fully aware of what he'd done, and legally fit to stand trial. On October 14, 1992, the court came back with its verdict, guilty on nearly every murder charge, death sentence attached to each one. The judge didn't stop at condemning Chikatilo either. He went after the police and prosecutors directly, calling out years of missed chances, including the execution of an innocent man for a crime he didn't commit, and the systemic failures that let all of this drag on for over a decade longer than it should have. On February 14, 1994, Chikatilo was executed by gunshot in a Moscow prison. No statement. No ceremony. Nothing that felt like closure for something this enormous. Just a quiet, almost anticlimactic end to a story that had kept an entire region afraid for more than 10 years. What keeps this case alive, decades later, isn't only the body count, staggering as it is. It's everything the case dragged into the light, a government so committed to its own image that it couldn't admit a monster like this could exist inside it. Forensic science just advanced enough to almost catch him, and just primitive enough to let him walk. An innocent man dead for a crime he never committed. And, buried under all of that failure, an investigation that somehow still got there in the end, not through some brilliant breakthrough, but through years of patient, exhausting, largely invisible police work that most people will never hear about. Chikatilo didn't stay hidden for 12 years because he was brilliant. He stayed hidden because the world around him was already looking the other way. And honestly, that's the part of this story that still gets under people's skin. This channel digs into real criminal cases from history, the investigations, the mistakes, the people the system failed, and the killers who almost got away with it. If this story caught your attention, there's more waiting for you. Check out the rest of the series for other cases just as unsettling, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. New cases every week. Backhand index pointing right. Watch more true crime cases, link to playlist. Bell subscribe for weekly episodes, subscribe link.